going to start. Thank you all for coming. My name is Anne Dekker, and on behalf of Madhan and Van Abben, I'd like to welcome you here for tonight. Although most of you have seen me today, because this evening is part of a larger conference. For those of you who don't know me, as I said, my name is Anne Dekker, and I'm organizing a conference together with Madhan and the Van Abben Museum here in Eindhoven about collecting and presenting born digital art, a matter of translation and quote-unquote historical knowledge. And part of this conference is really how the museum is dealing with new forms of art, to say it quite broadly, and especially digital art. So think of computers, internet, mobile phones, all those kind of things that you're using today, and how the museum is dealing with those kind of artifacts and artworks that artists are making with these media. So that's a bit of a context of what we've been doing during this conference. And since we started discussing about this already a couple of months ago, we also thought it would be quite nice to organize an event at Plaza Futura here, because Madhan will in the future move together with Plaza Futura to the Medlock on the old Philips factory. So we thought it would be a really good opportunity to make something collaborative here as well. And that's the reason we're here. And when we thought of, well, what shall we do then, also in line with the conference, we thought, well, since we are talking about digital media and about futures and histories, why not discuss and ask the moderators of the conference to give us some ideas that they have when they think about the museum in the future. So that's what we'll be doing tonight. And it will be really short, really sort of Pecha Kucha style. And there will be 4 presentations. The last one will be a bit longer, will be a film of 30 minutes, and the other 3 will be quite short. I'll quickly introduce the presenters: Sarah Cook from University of Sunderland and Crum, Christian Paul from Whitney Museum in New York, and Lena White from SF MoMA. And I think I'll just start immediately with Christian Paul, because he's the first from the Whitney.
Thank you very much. Okay, what I'm going to present tonight as the Museum of the Future will partly be reality and partly pure fiction and speculation. What you are looking at here is a Museum of the Future Whitney, which is moving from its site at the Upper East Side of New York down to the meatpacking district, to the beginning of the High Line. So it will move out of its Breuer building in Midtown to the downtown site into a Renzo Piano designed building that will have a study collection, a performance space, and other kinds of facilities. The rest I'm going to talk about is pure fiction, and I don't want you to think that it's something that the Whitney is actively proposing or pursuing. I'm actually making it up here. So the most futuristic aspect of the Museum of the Future for me would be the just natural integration of new media into museum operations. In every kind of show and gallery you would see new media next to any other art object. Shows on abstraction would include work by John F. Simon or Casey Reas, and Golan Levin would be represented in conceptual art. And new media would have its own committee. It would be collected and fully integrated into the collection. There would be preservation strategies in place for the medium, best practices. I would have my virtual servers on which I make backup copies, and works can be emulated from the very start and taken care of. So all of this, I think, would actually be the most futuristic aspect of what I would envision for a Museum of the Future. The rest of what I'm going to show you is actually pretty close to reality. So as in the use of augmented reality that we have seen by the Manifest AR group who have done interventions at MoMA, we are at MoMA, or at the Venice Biennale, augmented reality would be naturally integrated into the museum space. It would be medium artworks would be shown in the galleries as pieces in their own right. But augmented reality would also substitute for the label. It would present contextual information about pieces. It would show more collection works than could be shown on the gallery floors, and it would counteract politics of exclusion. So you would get a more complete picture of what the art in the galleries could be. As in this example, which is an app for Lygia Clark's Livre Obra, which has been created by Itaú Cultural, the works that are often cordoned off in vitrines and not accessible or touchable to you would have their own apps. They would be something you could take home, explore on your own, and interact with, again, with contextual information. Many artworks, new media artworks, probably could be taken home as apps. Perhaps this would be paid for as by micropayment if appropriate. So apps would be both contextual, would give access to works that are otherwise not accessible, and at the same time would be artworks in their own right. And there would be absolutely no confusion about contextual information or the art project in and of itself. As in another project site created by Itaú Cultural for the Lygia Clark exhibition, which is a VR world of Lygia Clark's architectures, many of the projects that would usually be represented in the galleries as architectural models, for example, as photos and on-site documentation, could be explored in the museum space in VR environments. You could walk into the architectures, or as in this case of the Lygia Clark architecture, you could actually play with them, explore them, interact with them on site. Well, this is something that plays out in the browser. Perhaps there would be a cave type of environment. You wouldn't need a headset anymore. You would just be able to walk in, be completely immersed in architectures and interact with them, explore them. Depending on what work it is, exhibitions could be created in the cloud, as in this project, which was done in a collaboration by Parsons, the New School for Design, and the Berlin University of the Arts, in which students actually created an exhibition that was then reproduced on both sides via 3D printing. So you would have prototyping in the cloud of projects if appropriate. And finally, there would be alternative distribution models for art. Perhaps art would be shared among institutions. Art forms such as software art, animations, or net art could be directly downloaded, distributed into other institutions. Software and generic hardware components could be provided at the exhibition site by the other institution. And on another level, there could be mixed distribution where software and hardware components need to be shipped, but the software would still be made available. So there would be licensing agreements among institutions that would allow for a much more efficient distribution of works, and artists would all be able to get their licensing fees upon distribution of the work. So that's just my very short proposal for a museum of the future.
I think that's fantastic if that is going to happen. And in what time frame are you thinking of?
Oh, 10 years.
Okay. Is there any questions or comments on this first presentation? You can also save them. We can do them later maybe, after the 3 first. Then I'll quickly turn around to equipment, and we'll have Sarah on. Thank you. And we can already witness how well organized technology is nowadays, that it will immediately work.
Shouldn't have said that.
It is a bit tricky, but never know. It might actually become true. Or maybe not. That is certainly spoken too soon. Indeed. Sorry, I do have to restart.
Could you just pull it out and plug it in again? Sometimes that's
Could try, yeah. Who knows?
or detect displays. Yeah.
Yeah, stuck now.
Yeah.
No. I want that. Yes. See? And this whole conference has also been very much about collaboration, and it works. Point proven. You can find it now, right?
I love to see
It's open source.
I have nothing quite so futuristic to talk about. That was very exciting. And instead I thought I would talk about a single work of art, because that single work of art to me at one point was a museum of the future, and I think represents the possibility that art itself can form the role of a museum, and that art has the possibility to future cast itself to predict the future. So this is a work made in 1973 by a Canadian artist named Glenn Lewis, who participated in what was known then as the Mail Art Network, so artworks that circulated via the Postal Service. And he performed his work under various other names, one of which was Flaky Rose Hips. And this artwork is called The Great Wall of 1984, and is installed in the National Science Library, so the Library of the National Research Council in Ottawa in Canada. And this is part of the building, but not exactly the building. What my first understanding of this work was from a book called Museums by Artists, that was published by Art Metropole, and it was proposals by artists for museums of the future. And I was aware of this networked distribution communication system that mail artists, meaning Postal Service artists, were working within. And I was fascinated by it, that an artist would send an instruction and then another artist would respond via the Postal Service to that instruction, and an artwork would be produced. And I think of that not so dissimilarly to what Christiane has just described about materials being produced on site and materials being shipped, and materials being transferred in other forms. This building, when I heard about this work, I desperately wanted to see it. I hadn't even seen this picture. All I knew was that Glenn Lewis had sent out a card that looks a bit like this, that had a number of boxes in it. Each card, the number of the box corresponded to a year. So I think it starts in 1984 and then goes forward into the future, and that artists would be invited to submit works that would go into that box. So they were picking their year in the future, and then they were making an artwork to go into the box. And that all the boxes are the same dimension. They are made of perspex, and it reads left to right, top to bottom, forward in time. So I loved the concept of the work. And the curator, Diana Nemeroff, and I drove all around Ottawa to try and work out which building this was in and how you would get into it, because it was the National Research Council, so not necessarily a building that's openly accessible to the public. And at the time we went to visit it, the building was still in its fabulous 1973 decor of shag rugs and really low furniture and fabulous oranges and browns. And we had to ask, where's the Glenn Lewis, where's the Glenn Lewis? And no one really knew what we were talking about until we said, where's the wall of Perspex boxes with crap in it? And then they could find it for us. And there's kind of no key to know what's in it. So this is a box of stuff sent by Chip Lord of Ant Farm. Here's another box that isn't sent by Ant Farm. This is a fabulous one. This is Ben Vautier's If Everything is Art, If God is Everywhere, Then God is Present as a Work of Art in This Box. Please look at him or her. This, I think, was Anna Banana. I'm not sure. I think there was a number of Canadian artists, and at one point there was a sort of list of who had definitely responded. That's the original card, but it's been modified and made into a watercolor by someone and sent back. This I think came from Ray Johnson. I think this was part of the New York Correspondence School. There's another sense. You can see some of the boxes are empty. And at some point in the last few years, Glenn did remake this piece using internet networks and asked people to send things. There was always the intention that these boxes would be continually updated. And I don't really believe they ever have been fully, but I know that was an intention. I don't know who the eggshells were. All of these sort of suggest a lot of the problems that you encounter in a museum today and you will continue to encounter in any museum of the future. Which is, what is it? Who remembers what it is? Who wrote down who it was by? How are we going to look after it? How much does it just reference itself? I don't know who this one is, but this is a Perspex cube inside a Perspex cube with photos of the building inside the Perspex cube of the building it is inside. Anyway, I think that's all I'm going to say about it.
Thank you very much. So I kind of missed, when did you see it?
It was made in 1973, and I first saw it in about 1997.
And have you seen it afterwards?
No.
Be good to see if that has changed indeed. And
We did talk about whether the National Gallery of Canada should acquire it, and if so, how.
yeah,
And then we realized it could not be separated from its building, and we just have to hope that the custodians of the building look after it.
quite a challenge. Nice. Lena, can I ask you to come forward? Do you want to say something before or afterwards?
Do you want to, maybe you want to pull it up, and then I think I'll need to hit play, so if you position it.
Yeah.
There we go. How about right there? That look good?
I'll do a bigger
For
here.
you?
Yeah.
Okay.
And then there you've got the play button.
Thank you. Okay. Well, so I'll be introducing SF MoMA, the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art's recommendation for the museum, a museum of the future. And I need to give a big shout out, tip of the hat, to Jill Starrett, who had the nugget of this idea and made this suggestion. So our recommendation is really about us, and by us I mean people working in museums. We're imagining a future where museum staff run, don't walk, act, don't wait, try and fail, try and succeed. In our view, the museums of the future will be biased toward action. So what we're going to see here is a video that's basically a promotional video for a interdisciplinary program at Stanford University. It's called the Design School, or the D.school at Stanford, and it's committed to destabilizing conventions that can get in the way of possibilities. So it's based on a bias toward action. But in terms of museums, we're imagining a future where museums, the roles and mindsets of museum staff have been transformed. We don't wait, we work agilely, we work easily at different speeds, fast and slow, and we work outside of our comfort zones quite naturally. So we try and we fail, and we try and we succeed, and we keep trying and trying and trying. So here we go.
So I'd always heard about the design school prior to coming to the business school, and then I would see my first year business school friends come back from across the street, as we like to refer to it, this glow and kind of excitement in their eyes.
I'm an engineering student, so I felt that my thinking was kind of very focused towards being very rational and analytical in everything I do. So I different perspective on things.
The boot camp class at the D.school is the kind of introduction to our way of thinking. It teaches students how to have creative confidence around our methodology, which we call design thinking. It teaches them to be empathetic, but it teaches them how to have impact on the world.
I think I'm a creative person, but since I was like 5 or 6 years old, I've learned to be more structured and structured and structured, which got me into my like super structured job and a super structured career path. So I feel like I'm learning how to combine structure with creativity, because sometimes the freedom to explore your ideas can take you somewhere that structure simply can't, and in fact can be more powerful and additive to like what you're trying to achieve.
I really want something that I can take into the real world. To be able to work with real partners just kind of made that more evident, like more urgent.
Then you get to your first project, and that's when just the depth of your insights, that's what really changes.
At least within this process, you need to like max out your creativity, but you also need to stay focused on the problem at hand.
Design thinking is the kind of thing you have to do, you have to experience. You have to have that moment where you're on a project and you come up with much better, more creative ideas than you thought were possible.
Being in the design school space and kind of being around boundless creativity and everyone's an entrepreneur kind of mentality made me think that maybe I would do something more entrepreneurial and have that kind of confidence to feel like that would be okay.
Maybe this is like a PhD student thing. Like we think a lot and then like have a lot of different ideas, but never really like try them out. I think the biggest thing that I learned was that we really need to bias towards action.
I very, very much value being able to work alone, but this class showed me how much stronger a project can be if you have multiple viewpoints coming in and actually on the entire process. Going forward, I probably will be more willing to collaborate in much deeper ways. I've let go of some of my fears.
The will to admit failure, to build up the courage to admit failure, I think that's really something that a lot of people need to learn. Being okay with failing. Being okay with failing so that you can move on, you can make more progress instead of kind of getting stuck at a dead end.
I don't know, but something like it's just like contagious, just like you never stop seeing opportunity now. You just think there'll be possibilities everywhere.
It's very nice. So could you maybe say a little bit more, because you said already indeed, like the SF movement taking this as an example of how they see there should be more action into the museum, but could you also maybe say a little bit more on how you would see that coming back in practice?
Well, I think it's interesting to think about how we're really shaking it up and making for a space in which it's okay. So, and I don't know how you actually implement this, but this, having the space where both trying and failing and trying and succeeding are valued. In other words, taking a chance, being okay with trying something out. And I'm not quite sure how you would put that into practice. I know, speaking about SF MoMA, we try to create spaces where it's safe for experimentation, and that's certainly something that we aspire to and actually is happening on any number of levels. I don't know if that's
in the production of many collaborative.
Sorry. It's not what I meant to do already. I'm just curious also, I mean, Christiana, you're showing the future, your wished for future in a way for Whitney. Do you see something like this happening as well?
A lot of it is, of course, reality in different areas. I mean, the applications I showed from Itaú Cultural are real, but they're just for one show, for one specific project. Augmented reality is really taking off. I don't think that it will take so long ultimately until we see those digital technologies being used as contextual tools. I'm not so sure about the art, but Getty is using quite extensive apps for shows such as Pacific Standard Time. I also have my doubts regarding the distribution models and collaborations, although it works with video. I mean, major institutions have collected video work together and figured out deals amongst them. But of course, institutions would need to put the infrastructure in place to really have a more sophisticated distribution and licensing system.
Is there any questions right now from the audience here? Or experiences that you want to share? It's like, I've kind of experienced this differently and I don't see that happening at all, or I see that already indeed happening, and is this really futuristic? Yeah, go ahead.
No, I wanted to ask Sarah about the work she showed. There's a couple of things I didn't get. The boxes were numbered by ears, right?
Yes.
And the invited artist had to send something for that ear, but
Yes.
It was not established that they should have sent it on that ear.
No.
And till when? I mean, the last year in the numbering was?
Something like 2000 something and 84, because
Okay.
it started 84.
Kind of 100 years.
Yes, yeah, more
Okay.
than, but yes. I don't remember the exact number of boxes. But it
And
was also
what's-
something about Canadian art at that time in the 1970s. A lot of artists, General Idea included, were making works about the year 1984. They were making works about the future to begin with, and other artists were participating in those almost like event structures that artists were creating.
And what's happening is that they are getting stuff more or less periodically, but unpredictably.
Yes.
Okay. No, that's what I wanted to know specifically. It's I would just comment that it's fascinating because it's something which really embodied what mail art was about. So using the postal network in a completely unpredictable way. And it has been experimented, this time delay somehow. Very few times, maybe Christian would know better than me, I'm sure. This delay in time, if we talk about the future, artists experimenting with something which could be programmed or could happen in the future. There are very few artworks that dealt with that.
I think Charlie Geer has a really nice thing where he talks about the museum as being the host of an unexpected guest. And then he talked about it in relation to media art, that actually you're hosting a ghost of a guest. You're not even hosting the guest itself, and whether that ghost is a spectre of the future or that ghost is like a remnant of some work that you tried to get into the museum and you couldn't. So I also really appreciate that aspect of thinking about what you're creating a museum is about creating a sort of future-proof box. And there's really no such thing as a future-proof box, because you never know what's going to come into that box.
So it might not want to be in a box.
Yeah, exactly.
So do we have something else for a box then? That'd be exciting to think about what that would be. Okay, we've come to the last bit of it, which is a film that I saw. I can't even remember when exactly I saw it and where I saw it. And when we were thinking of this screening evening, I sent out an email actually to some people. I think, Eddie, you were one of them as well, asking this really stupid questions like, I saw this film once. It was a clip of a film. It played in the future. It was about museums. Do you remember?
I remember getting that email from you. I remember not being able to tell you what it was.
Exactly. Well, luckily, I kind of refound it for some reason, and after digging through loads and loads of emails, and probably it had something to do with my old computer failing, and I had to get a new computer, and then finding all those emails again, after a couple of days. And all of a sudden it appeared to me that I had seen it, still not sure where I had seen it, but what I was always fascinating to me is that it was a sort of futuristic, utopian, dystopian idea of a museum. And so I contacted the artists, Neil Connings and Marisa Lewandowska, and they're both based in the UK at the moment. And they made this film, Museum Futures Distributed, it was called, as I later found out. And it's actually part of a larger project, including a book, and they were all commissioned by the Moderna Museum in Stockholm. And it was also an invitation from the museum directly. Lars Nitve, if I pronounce it directly, in 2008 that he approached them, well, we'd like to have a retrospective of our museum, because it's existing now for 50 years, and we would like to also have a sort of future perspective. So what will happen in the museum in 50 years? And that's really what this film is about. It's not so much about the current museum, but also about talking about the future, the history. And some of the things that we've already seen in the presentation so far will come back, and but also in different ways. And the enthusiasm I had when I saw the first clips and the memory I had of it, even more, still got back to me. But being older now, I guess, I got a bit more critical, and that's something that we might be able to discuss a little bit later on as well, because I think it will tackle also into the other presentations in very interesting ways. So.
We were all so young in 2008.
Yes. A few years can make a lifetime, you know. Okay, shall we? Are we turning off the lights or leaving them on? It's about 25 minutes, so it might be worth.
32.
Okay.
Ni hao. Hey. Hello? Hello, is that Ian Lindquist?
Ni hao. Yes, Miss Chan. This is Ayan. We are in sync.
Thank you so much for finding time. I know you must be very busy with the centenary
It's a
launch
pleasure.
and
We really admire your work on mid-20th century image ecologies, especially your research on archival practice.
well, I'm flattered. For many Asian non-market institutions, your pioneering work with long-term equity contract has been inspirational too.
So, let's begin.
Okay, just to refresh, for the centenary, I'd like to archive your live thread recall of Moderna.
Yep, that's fine. I've enabled about 20 minutes.
Okay, live. Maybe we could start with some personal history. What were you doing before you became executive at Moderna Musette 3?
Well, I joined Moderna 2 in 2049, almost 10 years ago. First as advisor to the development working group, then as part of the governance team. I participated in the forking of Moderna 3 in 251 and was elected fixed-term executive in 252, until today. I've got another 4 years in the project.
And before that?
Immediately before joining Moderna, I collaborated in the exhibition program at the Makba cluster in Mumbai for 6 years, although more in resource provision. That's where we worked on a version of that equity bond issue you mentioned.
And before that?
In programming, again at Tate in Doha for 4 years, particularly developing exhibitionary platforms, and even before that, I participated in research on cultural governance for the Nordic Congress of the European Multitude for 6 years. I suspect exhibition agency and governance are my real strengths.
Maybe we should dive into the deep end. Could you briefly say something of why Moderna 3 devolved and why was it necessary?
As you can imagine, there was a lot of consultation beforehand. It's not something we did without due diligence. Now, for almost 40 years, Moderna version 2 has explored and developed the exhibitionary form. And we pioneered the production of many collaborative exhibitions, resources, and assemblages. We helped build robust public, what you prefer to term, non-market cultural networks. and scaled those networks to produce our iCommons, part of the vast global public domain. Now, we have continually nurtured and developed emergent art practice. And Moderna can proudly and quite rightly say that we participated in shaping the early 21st century movement of art, from an exhibitionary practice based around art artifacts, spectacle and consumption, to that of embedded co-production.
Do you mean that...
Of course, there were many complex factors involved, but we were agent in the shift from a heritage cultural mindset of broadcast to that of emergent peer-to-peer meshworks. Following the logic of practice, we became an imminent institution. Although, having said all that, we've not really answered your question, have we? Given that Moderna 2 continues its exhibitionary research, some of us believe that exhibition as a technology and immanence as an institutional logic needed to be subject to radical revision. So this is what we intend to explore with Moderna 3. We want to execute some of the research, to enact, to be more agent than immanent.
Okay, I was wondering, could you say a...
Sorry to overwrite, but in a way the forking follows something of the tradition of the Moderna Musette. And Moderna 2 mutated through 1 because the tension between trying to collect, conserve and exhibit the history of 20th century art and at the same time trying to be a responsible 21st century art institution proved too difficult to reconcile. Moderna 1 continues its mandate, its buildings and collection has global heritage status. In turn, the early hybridization enabled Moderna 2 to be more mobile and experimental in its organizational form, in its devolved administration and its exhibition-making practice.
Could you just expand on the more complex factors you mentioned earlier?
That's a big question. Let me rerun a general thread from Composite. Well, a good place to start might be the bifurcation of the market for contemporary art from emergent art practices themselves. Although the public domain has a long genealogy, way back into ancient European land rights, commons projects, and commonwealth, it was the advent of digitalization and particularly very early composite language projects in the 1980s, which, and this appears astonishing to us now, were proprietary, that kick-started what were called open, free, or non-market resource initiatives. Of course, these languages, assemblages, and the resources they were building needed legal protection, licenses to keep them out of property and competitive marketization. The General Public License, the legendary GPL Legal Code, was written in 1989.
It's not so old.
So then text and images, either still or moving, artifacts, systems and processes, music and sound, either as source or assembled, all embedded plant, animal and bodily knowledge, public research and all possible ecologies of these resources began to be aggregated by the viral licenses into our public domain. Landmarks include the releasing of the sequenced human genome in 2001, the foundation of the Multitude Social Enterprise Coalition in 2009, intellectual property reform in the teens, the UN Multitude-initiated microtaxation of global financial transactions in 2013, which redirected so many financial resources to public domain cultural initiatives, and, well, I could go on and on and on. But anyway, most participants will be over-familiar with this thread.
Remind me, when did Moderna affiliate?
In archive records suggest Öppnedåga or Harifrin till Almanningen with Mejan in... I'm sorry. We did some collaborative open knowledge projects with Mejan in Stockholm in late 2009. And when Moderna 2 launched in 2012, we declared all new knowledge General Public License version 6 compliant.
Wasn't that initiated by Chus Martinez, one of your predecessors? She seems to have shaped early Moderna 2, which in turn became an inspiration globally.
It's nice you say so. Since 2012, we collaborated with the fledgling Nordic Congress in what was to become the European Multitude to form the backbone of the public domain cultural meshwork. It eventually convened in late 2022, so we were at source.
Okay, thank you.
Now, simultaneous with the exponential growth of the public domain was the market for what we still call contemporary art. Now, many historians locate one of the sources for the contemporary art market as the auction in 1973 of the art artifact collection of Robert and Ethel Scull, an extraordinary collection of paintings by pop male artists like Andy Warhol, Klaus Oldenburg, Ed Ruscha, and I recall Jasper Johns.
From Composite, I'm streaming this John shot analog film of the sale from New York MoMA's public domain archive.
It's a great film, and many of the art artifacts have subsequently devolved to Moderna.
I have the catalogue. It's present. I'm browsing.
Well, that auction set record prices for many artists. It also connected art artifacts with financial speculation in a way previously unimagined. By 1981, one of the big two auction houses, Sotheby's, was active in 23 countries and had a contemporary art market throughput of 4.9 billion old US dollars. Now soon, global trade fairs mushroomed. Commercial galleries flourished, and a sliver of branded artists lived like mid-20th century media oligarchs. By 2006, complex financial trading technologies were using art artifacts as an asset class, and most public modern art museums were priced out of the contemporary art market. Now, in retrospect, we wasted an enormous amount of time and effort convening financial resources to purchase and publicly own vastly overpriced goods, and we wasted time wooing wealthy speculators for sporadic gifts and donations too.
That connects. It was the same locally. The conflictual ethical demands in early modern art museums were systemic and obviously unsustainable. Reversing the resource flow and using transaction tax to nourish public domain cultural meshwork seems, well, inevitable.
Well, sometimes rethreading is such a wonderful luxury. Anyway, auction houses began to buy commercial galleries, and this dissolved the tradition of the primary, managed, and secondary, free art market. Now, as a consequence, by 2012, the contemporary art market was a true competitive market, with prices for assets falling as well as rising. Various contemporary art bond, derivative, and futures markets were quickly convened, and typically art asset portfolios were managed through specialist brokerages linked to banking subsidiaries.
I also see some local downturns linked to financial debt bubble bursting, spectacularly in 2009, again 224 and again 228. Market corrections?
Well, probably market corrections and their repercussions. Overall, the market expanded, matured in 227, and has remained sufficiently resourced ever since. More or less. By 2014, formerly commercial galleries, the primary market, had become a competing meshwork of global auction franchises. By 225, they began to open branded academies to ensure new assets were produced.
I can see the Frieze Art Academy in Beijing. That was one of the earliest.
The market for contemporary art became, to all intents and purposes, a competitive commodity market, just like any other. Of course, useful for generating profit and loss through speculation, and useful for generating public domain financial resources, but completely divorced from emergent art practice.
This might be a bit of a dumb query, but does Moderna feel that in the self-replication of the contemporary art market, that something valuable has been lost from public museums?
To be perfectly honest, no. No, we only experience benefits. You see, through the UN multitude distribution of transaction tax, we are much better resourced, which in turn has enabled us to develop our local cluster and node network. Generally, competitive markets thrive on artificial difference and managed risk. They're just too limited a technology to nurture or challenge or distribute a truly creative art practice. And just take all these private art asset collections built by speculator collectors supported through private donations. Apart from the hyper-resourced, they all ultimately fail. Then they're either broken up and recirculated through the contemporary art market, or, more usually, devolve to the multitude and enter public museum collections. Here at Moderna, we have benefited enormously from a spate of default donations. Consequently, we've a comprehensive collection of contemporary art artifacts through reversion.
Then this was the basis for the amazing modern and contemporary art exhibition in Shanghai in 2024. It was reconstructed as a study module while I was at the Open University in 250. I can still recall it. What a collection. What an amazing exhibition. So maybe here we could locate an ethic approaching something like a critical mass. As Madame Mousset's collection, exhibitions, and activities expanded, and of course other museums too, the ethic of public generosity is distributed, nurtured, and also encouraged. Everyone benefits. I can see that when the Ericsson Group pledged its collection, for instance, it triggered a whole avalanche of other private gifts and donations, like the d.school, like Kaiser Collections, or the Generali Foundation gift. Or like when the Guggenheim franchises collapsed as the debt bubble burst in 2018 and the Deutsche Bank executive decided to revert his collection.
We think that's a slightly different case and certainly of a different magnitude, although it's a common trajectory for many public-private museum hybrids.
It's certainly true of museums locally. The former Erlen Center of Contemporary Art in Beijing and Mokke in Shanghai, for instance.
That connects. The increased resources and the gifts, donations and reversions enabled us to seed our local cluster devolution. From 2015, we invested in partnerships with the Institut Maniska i Natvert in Stockholm and with agencies in Tallinn and also Helsinki, with the early reversion of the Second Life Hive and with Pushkinskaya in St. Petersburg. We created what was rather fondly termed the Baltic cluster.
From composite, I can see there had been an earlier experiment with a devolved Madonna. During the enforced closure in 2002-3,
yeah,
exhibitions were co-hosted with local institutions. There was even a Cosmobillion.
Yeah, and it was always considered something of a success. Distributing and reimagining the collection through the cluster, incidentally, we cut our carbon debt to almost 12, radically scaled our activities. So while developing locally, we also began to produce a wider Moderna Musée network. The first Moderna node opened in Doha in the United Arab Emirates. We participated in the local ecology's restructuring of resources from carbon to knowledge. That was in 2018. In 2020, Mumbai emerged with the Ex Habere 3-year research project in cooperation with several self-organized research institutions. I recall Nowhere from Moscow, the Critical Practice Consortium in London, and Sarai from Delhi. And as you already mentioned, Shanghai launched in 2024 with the landmark Contemporary Art exhibition. Then the Guangzhou node went live in 2029 with La Pâte Maudite, Bataille and the Accursed Share, a really timely exhibition. It explored the distribution of trust and well-being in a general economy, the ethics of waste and expenditure, and the love and terror implicit in uninhibited generosity. Isn't that node's location near your present Guangdong Museum hub, on Ursha Island by the Haiyan Bridge?
We're almost neighbors. As for La Pâte Maudite, much of the source work is still alive and still very present.
We saw you did some restoration to the image server codex recently. Thank you for that.
My pleasure.
Our most recent node emerged in Sao Paulo in the Americas in 2033 through the agency of the Alan Turing Centenary Project, Almost Real Composite Consciousness.
Okay, if I may, I'd like to loop back with you to the 20s and 30s. It's when many academic historians think we entered a new exhibitionary golden age with Moderna. You co-produced a suite of landmark projects, many of which are still present.
We're not too comfortable with the idea of a golden age. Maybe our work became embedded again. Anyway, if there was a golden age, we'd like to think it started earlier, maybe in 2018. We set about exploring a key term from early machine logic, feedback, and we made a readdress to the source, the legendary Cybernetic Serendipity exhibition at the Institute of Contemporary Art in London on the exhibition's 50th anniversary.
From composite, I see Tate has many public domain archive resources. It's recorded as the first exhibitionary exchange between visual art and digital assemblies.
For us at Moderna, that exhibition set in motion 2 decades of recurrent projects exploring art, technology, and knowledge. Its most recent manifestation, linked to the Turing research, has resulted in Moderna III's cooperation on a draft amendment to Article 39 of the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights. We are seeking to extend certain rights to organic, synthetic, composite intelligence.
You are co-producing sovereign composites.
Yes, that's what I was hinting at earlier, about Moderna being more agent and executing as well as exhibiting.
我现在明白了. But sovereign composites. I now understand Moderna's centenary proposal for a museum of their wishes. It's absolutely amazing. I know it's a very common thread, but it's definitely worth rerunning. The one about the foundation of the Moderna Musette's collection with the Museum of Our Wishes exhibition in 1962, and how this was revisited in 2006 by Lars Nidver with the Museum of Our Wishes too, to address the lack of women artists within the collection.
We see our legacy as a resource, not a burden. It's something we've been working with for a while, recursive programs. It's at root. Actually, Wish 2 was finally fulfilled in 2022 with the reversion of some Dora Maar photographs, but with the emergence of self-conscious composite intelligence, addressing their wishes seemed appropriate, even necessary. And it's true, if the draft amendment is ratified, it will be an amazing achievement.
So even if you don't like the term, maybe a new golden age is beginning.
For that, we'll just have to wait and see. But earlier, you were right to suggest that in 2020, with Ex Habere, the practice of exhibition, we consolidated the idea of emergent art and distributed new institutional practices.
In the Asian network, it's common knowledge that the Ex Habere reaffirmed the role of museum in civil society.
Well, to start, we uncompressed the Latinate root of exhibition, ex habere, to reveal the intention of holding out or showing evidence in a legal court. It's obvious that implicit in exhibition is the desire to show, display, and share with others. By grafting this ancient drive to desires for creative co-production, we enabled exhibitions to remain core to Moderna's aspirations. It's also true that to source, participate, co-produce, and share, to generate non-rivalrous resources, are vital to the constitution of a public domain, and indeed a civil society. There's a neat homology. Ex Habere distributed these values, and it's true, they replicated at an astonishing speed.
It's so good to be reminded. Even I tend to take the power of exhibition as a technology for granted. Do you think that this is because artists and others moved into a collaborative relationship with Moderna?
Varska Viparia. Where to start? Artists and others realized that the 19th century ideological construction of the artist had reached its absolute limit. As configured, art as a creative process had ceased to innovate, inspire, or have any critical purchase. Quite simply, it was irrelevant.
Everywhere except in the contemporary art market.
That heritage broadcast communication model of culture privileges creative exchanges between the artist and media in the studio manufactory, exchanges which were distributed through competitive trade and collecting institutions. At best, broadcast extended a small measure of creative agency to the encounter between audiences, often referred to as passive viewers, and artworks.
Okay, I have material from composite. So, even when this model was disrupted, like in 1968, the Medallion, a model for a qualitative society exhibition at Moderna, for example, it looks like we fell back into, perhaps the wider creative ecology was just not receptive enough.
You might be right, Miss Chan. It was really when artists began to imagine art as a practice and explore creativity as a social process.
Sometimes around the late 1990s, perhaps?
Yes, then we could detect something of a change. Artists began to engage creatively with institutions and vice versa. with all aspects of institutional practice, of course through co-producing exhibitions, but also through archival projects, which you've done so much to research, Ms. Chan, through organizational engagement, administration, and so on.
Okay, I'm browsing material from Composite on institutional critique, Michael Asher and Hans Hacke. They seem to be mostly artists from the Americas in the 1970s and 80s.
Not sure if those are the appropriate resources. Artists associated with institutional critique, I recall Michael Asher and Hans Hacke, also Julie Alt and Group Material, or Andrea Fraser. They had a much more antagonistic and oppositional relationship with exhibitionary institutions. Now, they resented being represented by an exhibitionary institution, especially those linked to a 19th century ideology.
Okay, I'm now browsing material on Sputniks, EIPCP, Bodo Latour, Maria Lind, Ateluku, Van Abbe Museum, Superflex, Frank Lecard, Rax and Sarai, Moderna's project, Bat de Bar.
Yes, this constellation feels more relevant. As artists rethought their practices, they recognized themselves as a nexus of complex social process, and that creativity was inherent in every conceivable transaction producing that nexus, at whatever the intensity and regardless of the scale of the assembly. The huge challenge for all of us was to attend to the lines of force, the transactions, and not be dazzled by the subjects, objects, or institutions they produced. We recall that it was under these conditions that artist practices merged with Moderna, merged into relations of mutual co-production, and so in exchange, Moderna began to think of itself as a creative institution, subject to constant critical and creative exploration.
So these were the forces generating Moderna 2 in 2012.
You're right. Now, we simply stopped thinking of ourselves as a 19th century museum, which had to constantly expand, commission signature buildings, evolve huge administrative hierarchies, exhibition, education, support, management, and so on, and more on instituting in the ancient sense of the word of founding and supporting, on instituting creative practice. So we started to play, risk, cooperate, research, and rapidly prototype, not only exhibitions and research projects, but ourselves. Some values were lost, which is always painful, and yet others were produced, and those most relevant maintained, nurtured, and cherished. Now, we learned to invest long-term, without regard for an interested return. And that's how we devolved locally and networked globally. Now, we've had some failures. Either exhibitions couldn't convene the necessary resources, or we made mistakes. But as an imminent institution, most experiences were productive. I'm not sure if that jump cut thread answered your query.
Sort of.
The short answer could be that artists have transformed Moderna, and we in turn transformed them.
Okay, but that last sound bit is rather banal, although the thread is not uninteresting.
Ironically, our playful devolution of Moderna 2 reanimated the historical collection displayed in version 1. We freed art artifacts from their function of recounting the history of 20th century art, however alternative, discontinuous, or full of omissions we imagine that thread to be. And once free, they engaged with real-time discursive transactions. They became live again, contested nodes and competing transactions of unsettled bodies of knowledge.
I'm not sure I'm following this. As time is running out and there's so much to cover, I just wonder if you could you recall, even briefly, some beacon exhibitions, like transactional aesthetics or the ecology of fear?
Radsland's ecology, or the ecology of fear, was timely given the viral pandemic throughout DNA storage. So many systems were compromised, and the various wars that were being waged against difference and public attention for material resources, energy. And I guess the same with transactional aesthetics. It was the right moment to be participating in the production of local social enterprise and well-being initiatives.
Could you also just mention the legendary Autorat, Alternative Research in Architecture, Resource, Art and Technology exhibited at Madhan in 1976, which you revisited on its 50th anniversary in 2026. From composite, I can see archive materials. They're present.
Well, there's not much to add. Obviously, the first version of Ararat explored appropriate local technologies for buildings and urban systems using sustainable resources. In 1976, this was the beginning of our understanding of a global ecology and of the finite nature of mineral resources, especially carbon. Given our population reached 8 billion in 2026, it was vital to revisit the exhibition, to somehow take stock. Well, the first shock was that so little of the initial exhibition was recoverable. We invested in reconstruction and archival research. It's all public domain composite now. And the second was the realization that so little of the source exhibition had had any real effect. We suspect a serious flaw in the exhibitionary form.
The lack of resources from those early exhibitions is always disheartening. It's hard to imagine a time before even rudimentary public domain meshworks, embedded devices, and semantic interfaces.
Well, one of the great outcomes of the Moderna Golden Jubilee celebrations in 2008 is that they revisited and reflected on the preceding 50 years. We recently found shadow traces of a Moderna history book, and for reasons that are not entirely clear, it remained unpublished during the Jubilee celebrations, so we intend to issue a centenary publication. We'll be sure to send you a copy.
I see we've overrun. I'm so sorry. I just wonder before we disconnect, what is Moderna resourcing in the near future?
Well, for us, there are some beautiful assemblies emerging. Real-time consensus is moving from a local to a regional scale. Triangle in the African multitude is distributing amazing regenerative medical technologies. Renewable energy has moved through the 74% threshold. Live, almost retro music performance is popular again. Nanotechnology has come of age, and one-to-one molecular replication will soon be enabled, linked to scanning technology hardwired to the manufacturers in the Asian network. Outside of heritage, singularity will be overwritten by difference. Now that's exciting.
Exciting indeed. Thank you so much, Ian. It's been a privilege. Enjoy the centenary celebrations, and we'll all be there with you in spirit. 再见. Goodbye.
Thank you, Miss Chan. Goodbye. 再见. Heido.
very much. Yeah. I'm sure you can see why I loved the first time I saw it. But again, looking back now, after a couple of years, and I'm also wondering, indeed, is like, well, how likely is this a reality to become true? Or can we say this reality might already be here in many ways? Maybe not the whole economic side, the financial side, but many elements that she's talking about are being implemented at the moment. And that's also kind of what I like about science fiction in a way, is that it tells you more about the present in a way than it does about the future. And you can see that quite clearly here as well. And there's these weird contradictions. There's this really old furniture, and there's this really slick corporate filming style. So how does that all go together? And so that's something that I'd like to discuss maybe with you also as well. How much is it focused on the future, or is it much more about this present that we're living in at the moment? And I mean, there's some really remarkable things, I think, in this film, and that also came up in the discussions. And whereas, for example, Christiane Paul just now presented her, he made her presentation and really advocating for a very distributed heritage in a way. Here it was almost like the heritage was still stable, was still object-oriented, and it was much more about the museum as a presentation institute that became very flexible and very explorative, very unstable in a way, which was quite contradictory in a way. It's like, well, that's kind of weird that the structure of the museum and the presentation, administration becomes something completely different from its heritage, its collection. That kind of really struck me. And also the whole issue of risk experimentation, prototyping, is really what a media lab at the moment is doing. And for me it was also kind of fun if you think about that. Indeed, it's like Baltan is indeed in the Van Abbe, but how is that relation really taking shape? Is that something of the future? Is that already happening? Has that already happened, and have we surpassed it maybe? Maybe not.
It seems aligned with what the Cultural Ministry of the Dutch government proposes for the future of art.
Yes. We might not want to have him seeing this. Yeah. No, it's a very, in a way, it's and that's what I found sort of paradox in a way. It's a very promotional film almost, but I don't think it was a promotional film 5 years ago. So that's also telling in a way. It's like, wow, so much has changed in just such a few years. And that's why I'm also looking at it now, something completely different. That I think like, well, what is really set here? And it's actually taking shape now, but not maybe in a way that we really like it, or that we really benefit from it, or do we?
It's not mentioning any big crisis. That's a big difference looking at it after a few years.
Mm-hmm.
We are so involved in it that it seems already from a recent past.
Also, what it tells me is that it feels like if discourse takes the place of everything, like that discourse is the museum of the future. So what we're talking about, so that the discourse has taken the place of a production, of a research, of a of an exhibition, as if the end result is that. It gives me that feeling, like that science fiction feeling. Forget about making, forget about researching, forget about, just sit and speak. So in a way we are in the museum of the future, because this is what we do.
Yeah, no, it's interesting. Whereas, on the other hand, they are speaking very much indeed about founding and supporting and moving away from expanding, but very much helping and co-producing.
A certain element like that speed and that certainty and the sort of total efficiency of the discourse really stands for the sign that there's nothing else.
But the tape was mentioned quite a few times. And do you recognize anything?
No, I mean, it is a really fascinating film, isn't it? I mean, I think one of the reasons that Tate was mentioned is probably because it followed on from a project that was done at Tate about economies, so about looking at the economic environment, the position of Tate in relation to the city. So, but I suppose one of the things that that the film looks at, which is interesting, is like if we all start talking about a particular phenomenon, whether it's participation or discourse, you know, we think it's something that's specific to our domain, but of course it isn't. And it's really hard to take stock of that. And I think that's what the film plays with in a really interesting way, and what also our colleague here touched upon. Yeah. I mean, some things, you know, echo what Leonard was talking about as well, the idea of risk and, you know, but there's also something in it that makes us all feel a bit queasy, right?
Well, it seems like the museum director has become the uber executive organizer, and I mean, on the one hand, the artist has gained a certain privilege in society as the creative cultural producer involved in everything from nanoscience research to, you know, geopolitical whatever, which is also happening in our practice. But they don't really talk about art at all. So I mean, art as we know it, seems to have kind of gotten lost from the equation. And I think that part of our uneasiness about it is that it becomes such a hyper administrative kind of ethos. So the museum management 20 years ago was not as highly professionalized as it is today. And the speak, the jargon, the rhetoric, the discourse has become much more oriented towards business. You can't be a museum director unless you can run a big business, because basically you are running a big business. And you need to be able to speak, but it just seems to be sort of hypertrophy of that trend. And yeah, that makes us uneasy, I think.
But I suppose it's this issue, it's an extension to sort of public policy about cultural capital, to this kind of extreme example where it sounded like, so certain transactions were taxed because the museum was then going to, it's almost like restorative justice or something, right? Some weird kind of paradigm being played out.
I was okay with that part.
Yeah?
Yeah.
On the taxing?
Well, putting everything in the public domain, I thought that was really good. Great.
But it's what is the museum supposed to do, right? That's, you know, is it supposed to make good? You know, it's like, you know, the riots happen in London. You know, what's Tate got to say about the riots? What can Tate do about rioting? You know, and you just think, well, you know, that's where.
But the Tate became the answer, instead of being, you know, the reflective, disconnected part. It became the leader in the solution.
Exactly, and that's what is reflected, I think, in something in the film.
Yeah, it has this really, really very positive side to it. And then, on the other hand, you see it's also about, you know, maybe not. But also very things like a re-exhibition of the cybernetic exhibition. I mean, how likely is that to be happening? I would love.
There have been a number of efforts to try to do it.
Someone suggests it every few months.
Yeah. In a way, for me it was more how it was able to swallow and digest the whole past. which is typical in science fiction. I mean, to kind of recontextualize and rewrite the history all the time. So all the reference points, like cybernetic serendipity, was, I mean, for most of us, was kind of lost after a few minutes as one point in a long sequence of references.
I mean, it did seem like a Faustian bargain, you know, selling a certain soul. But I thought the reference to cybernetic serendipity was misplaced, because historically, the Moderne Musette, which was led for many years by Pontus Hultén, the great Cetus curator, was very much involved in promoting what became the 9 Evenings. And Hultén was a friend with Billy Kluver, and so it was curious to me that they didn't look at that particular history and highlight that, because that's maybe even a more important Swedish Moderne Museet contribution to this history. But it was really invigorating to know that, you know, by 2013, 2013,
only days away,
50 years, you know, we'll start reappraising this, and art and technology will be the thing, right? So we only have a few more days to wait.
Happy New Year.
And it kind of gives the impression that history was this fabulously smooth development curve, as opposed to a totally crazy roller coaster of, you know, kind of, you know, misconnections and you know, peaks and troughs and
Well, they're different threads.
It was very neat, wasn't it?
But isn't that what happens to history though when it gets written down?
Well, the history according to the museum, which was the victor in this history.
Well, not if you don't have. Somebody was saying today actually in our workshop about how it's not there isn't. It's actually a very jerky, you know, curve. There's a whole bit missing from museum collections. You know, like, you know, whole voids where, you know, even according to that history, it's not a smooth development curve. It's just kind of sudden cliffs and fall-offs, because there's not, you know, collections from, you know, across the years. So, you know, especially with something like new media, then it's almost impossible to see, you know, to be able to compare that work with other kinds of work and what was happening at the time through the years, because there's just, you know, gaps. And,
but you do your 50-year anniversary.
Well, exactly. You do the new media show, and then, you know, or the new media issue in a magazine, and then nothing for done it.
With all that tax money flowing in, we can easily reconstruct cybernetic serendipity, the 9 Evenings, the software exhibition, Hultén's.
Any volunteers?
Yeah.
And how disappointed will we be with them? Will we prefer the documentation and think, oh, this really wasn't as good as we thought it was going to be? We should have just got on with something new.
Yeah, it's that way when we re-experience stuff from the 90s.
Yes. What's going to be any different about the shows? Exactly.
Yeah, we'll see a clip of that tomorrow morning. See how disappointed you get there. Or how excited. That remains to be seen.
But that's kind of a documentary issue in a way. I mean, how do we keep alive the excitement of work experienced in the moment of its creation? When that moment is gone, the work might not function, and there seems to be a responsibility to teach that as part of a history and to recapture and impart what was so exciting and interesting about that work at that moment in time.
But at the same time, I think that can be hazardous, because, you know, once we got these CD-ROMs image and functioning in emulators, Annette had this moment where it was like, oh, ooh. You know, so I think, you know, if we are preserving that feeling, that can become distorted and exaggerated, idealized over the course of 50 years.
Are you questioning my memories?
Not at all, sir.
That CD-ROM in 1994 rocked.
I'm not. I am not disagreeing.
We'll talk tomorrow.
also,
It's a good question.
in 20 years' time, you may well be able to have a different perspective.
Yeah.
You know that.
Yeah, like Annette's response to the film a few years later.
Yeah.
And
Well,
she's
you
not so
know,
young
I think-
anymore.
There's another point that there was a moment in the CD-ROM hackathon where I saw very young people looking at old CDs that I just remembered the experience, but they were excited about hacking it to try and get a peek at an experience, and so it was completely different from a person who can just think about it and remember what it was like versus a person who missed that opportunity because they were too young. And so for them, it's exciting to try and figure out how can I hack this and how can I get a glimpse into that moment. So it just was this really weird experience to think about why are they trying to see that stuff? No, well, I mean trying so hard. It's not like you put the CD in. They had to spend hours just getting the computer to maybe play it. Yeah.
Which becomes part of its re-experience mythology.
I think it's been a long day for many of us.
Yeah. I'm just waking up.
You're jet lagged. You don't count on this. But waking up might be a good thing at the bar. So thank you all very much for coming. Thank you, Olga, for organizing this Plaza Futura.
Oh, and there's you can get one drink with your tickets. So I don't know, you probably show it to the bar.
Oh, we have to show the ticket?
It's includes one drink.
Yes. I'm good there.
Carmen, we still have a few?
There are a few more left, not that many, but there are a few.
Okay, we'll see you at the bar.
Hey, how are you? Good to see you. How are you doing? I'm doing really well. Yeah? Yes. Apart from jet lag. Yeah.